Good evening, ADAS. It's a pleasure to be back again. And as you can see, we're talking this evening about the Star of Bethlehem. We're asking ourselves, are there any astronomical candidates that fit the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew? But not only the Gospel, there's one other account that we really try and want to match up to, and that's the account in the Christmas Carol. That's enough of that. Right. So what we're talking about is the Gospel of St. Matthew. It was written quite a long time after the Nativity, but we're going to take it as an account and ask ourselves, if we have an account of the Magi seeing a star in the east and then going to see the birth of Christ, what are the basic elements that we need to account for in an astronomical candidate? Then we'll be asking ourselves, how many candidates might there be conceivably, and how well do they fit the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew? And then we'll be looking at dates to see if there were things in the sky that fit date-wise to the Nativity as we understand it. And then we'll be looking at a little bit of software called Starry Night, and we'll be looking at what was in the sky around about the birth of Christ. And then we'll summarize. So let's remind ourselves what are the key features in the Gospel according to St. Matthew that we are trying to account for in an astronomical candidate. So the principal elements I'm going to highlight in red. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem, it is said, prompted by a star in the east. So that's the first thing we've got to think about. If there's an astronomical candidate, could it have been interpreted as a star in the east? Remember, it didn't say they went east. They saw a star in the east and went west. They got to Jerusalem and asked Herod the king, what's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews? So for some reason they interpreted what they saw as birth of the King of the Jews. But Herod wasn't really aware of what they were talking about, so that's another aspect that we need to be able to explain. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky. And finally the star stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 aspects in red, ideally, are the 5 aspects that we want to try and explain with an astronomical candidate. The fact that it was seen first in the east, it was interpreted as signifying the birth of the King of the Jews. Herod didn't seem to make that same interpretation, and the star needs to be able to reappear and stop in the sky. If we can find a candidate that meets most, if not all, of those 5 criteria, then maybe we found a good candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. So one more time, let's just remind ourselves of the lyrics in the first verse of the famous Christmas carol. So when we think about the lyrics in We Three Kings, we really ought to be comparing it with what's in the Bible, at which point we say to ourselves, well, why do we talk about 3 magi? Why do we talk about 3 wise men? The Bible doesn't talk about 3 visitors to Christ during the Nativity. It doesn't talk about 3 magi. It doesn't talk about 3 wise men. The only reason people assume there were 3 visitors is because it does mention the 3 gifts that were brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it is assumed that there were 3 people. Now, it might have been that there were 20 of them, and 17 just didn't bring gifts. Why were we supposed to bring gifts? So the only reason the 3 is there is because of the 3 gifts, not 3 magi. So we really shouldn't have 3 in the title of We Three Kings of Orient Are. And where'd you get kings from? There's nothing in the Bible that talks about kings. They talk about wise men, magi, the plural of magus, wise men. So we really shouldn't have kings in there either. And we don't know where they came from. We don't know whether they came from Persia or India or Mongolia. So we don't know the geographic origin of these particular visitors to the Nativity of Christ. So we shouldn't have Orient in there either. And remember, they saw a star in the east and then went in the opposite direction. So arguably they didn't follow the star. They were prompted by a star in the east and they went the other way. So really they didn't follow yonder star. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces here because there's not an awful lot left. Now, being a physicist, being a scientist, being a good scientist, I like precision, I like accuracy. So we really shouldn't have this Christmas carol as it stands. We should have it somewhat more accurate. And so I would suggest instead of "We three kings of Orient are," we really ought to have "We indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are saw a star." Now it doesn't meter quite as well as "We three kings of Orient are," and now you can see why physicists really don't write Christmas carols. And we really shouldn't talk about the three wise men because 3 is just an invented number. There's no indication that there were 3 wise men. So we really ought to just talk about n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. It's more than 1 because magi is plural, so there's definitely more than one of them, and the gender apparently is male, therefore they were men rather than women. So n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1, basically. And we have to remind ourselves about, when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem, what we mean by star. If we're astronomers, we understand what we mean by star, but a star 2,000 years ago doesn't mean the same as the star that we understand today. It doesn't mean a great ball of gas undergoing thermonuclear fusion. It basically means something seen in the night sky, other than the moon, which is obviously an object in its own right. And of course, we still have some labels for stars that even come through to modern day. So we know that, for instance, the word planet is derived from wandering star. When we look at the stars in the sky, yes, they're all moving because of the rotation of the Earth. They're all apparently moving because of the rotation of the Earth, but they're all in fixed positions in the constellations, except for some dots of light which appear to move between the constellations. These wandering stars are what we now call planets, but originally they were just called wanderers or wandering stars. Nothing to do with Lee Marvin. And of course, many stars are point-like, but some stars seem to have hairy tails. So broom stars or occasionally hairy stars are what we now call comets. We understand why they have the appearance they have, but of course, 2,000 years ago, they were simply labeled as a different type of star. And we still use the term occasionally, colloquially, shooting star when we're talking about meteors, especially if we're talking to members of the lay public who might not be so familiar with the word meteor, but are very familiar with the concept of a shooting star. So all of these are stars in the sense that they are objects seen in the night sky, objects that can be seen in the night sky other than the moon, which, as I say, has a category all of its own. So when we think about what are the possible candidates for the Star of Bethlehem, we shouldn't be fixated on objects that we now know to be stars. We should also think about comets and planets and other things as well, which could, in principle, be accounts of the Star of Bethlehem. Do we get any clues by looking at how the adoration of the Magi has been depicted over the years? Of course, these various things, I'm showing the dates at the bottom, these various depictions are many centuries after the Nativity, and we find that the actual depiction of the adoration of the Magi is all about what people expect to see. In other words, there's always 3 kings. There's never any other number, despite the fact the Bible doesn't specify, and they usually look like kings rather than anything else. What's in the sky here? Well, it looks like it might be a star shining radiance down onto baby Jesus, but there's no real clue as to what the Star of Bethlehem might be from a picture like that. This is Botticelli, 1475. That's Botticelli himself, perhaps, sort of photobombing his own painting in a sense. There's Joseph in the back, looking very bored and taking no part in the celebration. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he took no part in the conception either, so maybe it's appropriate that he takes no part in the celebration. But again, the Star of Bethlehem presumably is that object right at the top, and we can't really tell what that is. 1423, again, the star is presumably that object in the background, no clue as to its origin. One of the few Giotto that actually show the Star of Bethlehem not as a point-like star with loads of spikes coming out of it, but what looks convincingly like a comet in the background, which is why the spacecraft that visited Halley's Comet was called Giotto. So this at least is an admission that maybe the Star of Bethlehem wasn't a star in the sense that we know it, but Giotto, as far as I know, didn't have any inside information as to the nature of the Star of Bethlehem. Perhaps he thought it just looked better in the painting rather than anything else. Rubens, I can't remember the date for this one, but here, one of the few depictions of the Adoration of the Magi in which the Star of Bethlehem apparently does not appear in the sky, as far as I could tell. In the background there, we don't have a star. All we seem to have is a two-headed camel, which is looking over from the back there. But apart from that, nothing else that we can glean. So it's no surprise that the artwork doesn't actually give us any clues as to the nature of the Star of Bethlehem. So how do we sort of go about interpreting the astrological significance of what was seen at the time, what might have been seen at the time? We have to remember that every planet and every bright star, every constellation, in particular all the zodiacal constellations, the 12 or perhaps 13 constellations of the zodiac through which the planets move, because all the planets are moving in roughly the same plane, so all the planets tend to be seen in the same 12 constellations of the zodiac. So all of the planets, all of the stars, all of the constellations had some astrological significance, quite often more than one particular feature. So for instance, Venus, or if you go from one mythology to another, if you jump backwards and forwards between Greek and Roman, Venus or Aphrodite is associated with beauty or fertility or birth. And Jupiter or Zeus, if you again change mythologies, associated with royalty. Jupiter is considered the king of planets, just like Zeus and Jupiter, the gods, were considered the head god, if you like, the god of gods. And if we look at individual stars, we know that Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and perhaps you can tell from its name, the first three letters of its name, that's also associated with kingship as well. So you can think of Regulus as the king of stars. And Leo itself is often seen by many different cultures as the outline of a lion because of the characteristic sickle shape at the head of Leo the lion. And so the constellation of what we call Leo, many other cultures called Leo, and that got it associated with the land of Judea, which has a flag on which is a lion. It's their symbol, if you like. So the land of Judea and the people of Judea are often associated with a lion. So there are a number of different associations. Why should anybody associate what's going on in the sky with particular significance? Well, it's because astrologers believed that that's how you find out what mankind has in store, or if you like, what God has in store for mankind. If you read the stars and if you interpret the nature of what planets are doing what in what zodiacal constellation up against which stars, you can then, by reading the sky, you can get an idea of what God has in mind for the future. Are we going to have good crop next year? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have an earthquake? God has sorted all this out and will post in the sky the intention of what he has for mankind. So one way of thinking of it is to think of the sky as being God's Facebook page. That's where he posts, this is what's going to happen. That's why people kept a close eye on the sky. That's because they could basically say what's in store and then prepare perhaps for a failed crop next year or something like that. So that's why they were always looking at the sky. So what do we think are the candidates? Well, we're going to look at a few possible candidates, and we're going to ask ourselves for each candidate, could it have been interpreted as a star in the east? Could it have been interpreted as a significant event or appearance? Is it possible or is it reasonable that Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about, having seen said sign in the sky? Could the star reappear in the sky, and could the star stop in the sky? Those are the 5 criteria that we pulled out of the account of St. Matthew, the 5 little bits in red. So let's have a look at possible candidates and ask ourselves whether it fits the bill or not. Could it have been a shooting star? Well, could it have been a star in the east? Well, as you know, shooting stars, meteors, regardless of whether they're sporadic meteors or whether they're part of a meteor shower or even a meteor storm, they appear pretty much all over the sky. They might appear to be coming from a particular radiant in the sky, but they appear almost anywhere. So why would you ever say there was a star in the east? Would it have been significant? Well, given that we get a dozen or so meteor showers each year, pretty much every year, why would the appearance of a bunch of shooting stars be considered significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of the significance? Well, if there's almost no significance there, then sure, Herod wouldn't be aware of what they were talking about. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, shooting stars, as we know, they're either sporadic and they occur at random, or you get them coming in bunches of meteor showers. And yes, you can have a shower one month and then they die away, and then next month there might be another shower. So yes, they could reappear in the sky. Could the star stop in the sky? Well, if you're talking about a whole load of shooting stars, why would you talk about a shooting star that stopped in the sky? That doesn't seem to make any sense. So meteors, shooting stars, yes, definitely stars in some sense, but doesn't really fit the bill. What about the appearance of a comet? Yes, that particular icon does look more like a meatball than a comet, but there we go. That's the icon that I came up with. Could a comet appear in the east? Certainly could. Comets can appear pretty much anywhere, given their orbits. Could it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, if it had a bright enough tail and a long enough tail, the appearance in the sky could have been considered significant. But that's part of the problem. Comets are like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable. So we know pretty much where they are in terms of how they orbit the sun, but we can't easily predict what the brightness of a particular comet's tail is going to be, and winding the clock back, it's very difficult to say how bright a tail would have been in the past. But let's assume that there was a bright comet with a bright tail that would have been significant. But if it was that bright that it was significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of said thing? Now, Herod's eyesight wasn't particularly good, but Herod, as a king, has got a court of astrologers. The astrologers would be looking at the sky, just like the Magi, and they would be advising Herod as to what was in the sky and what was coming up next. So if it was bright enough to be significant, it's not obvious why Herod wasn't already aware of it. Can a comet reappear in the sky? Well, yes, comets go around the sun, and every once in a while they'll go out of our sight simply because they're getting too close to the line of sight to the sun, and so they'll disappear from our view for a while, and then they'll reappear on the other side of the sun, and so a comet could reappear in the sky, depending on how it's orbiting the sun. Could the comet stop in the sky? Well, generally speaking, comets are going around the sun like everything else. It is actually conceivable that the comet might actually be heading directly towards the Earth, in which case it might appear not to be moving through the sky from night to night. So perhaps that ought to be a question mark rather than an X there. But for this reason here, it doesn't quite seem to fit the bill. What about a nova? What about a new star? Not technically a new star, but a star newly visible, one that flares up in brightness and was previously either very faint or perhaps below the limit of naked eye visibility, and then for a while it flares up, becomes brighter, and so as far as an astrologer is concerned, a new star has appeared in the sky. It's a fixed star in the sense it's in a fixed position relative to the constellations. Could it appear in the east? Well, depending on which constellation it happened to appear in, yes, it could appear in the east. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was a bright enough nova, such that a bright star appeared where there used to be no star in that position, that could be significant. Again, we have the problem, if it's bright enough to be significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of the appearance of a new star? Could the star reappear in the sky? It's a question mark rather than an X. You can get recurrent nova that brighten so that the star becomes a few magnitudes brighter than it previously was and then generally fades away. It is possible for that to reoccur years, decades later. Generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily come back regularly over short-ish periods. If we're talking about a period of perhaps months, it's difficult to see how a star could go through a nova phase, get much brighter, fade away, and then get brighter again. Possible, but unlikely, so that doesn't seem to fit the bill. The star stopped in the sky. If the star is fixed relative to all the other stars, why would you say it stopped in the sky? Because in that sense, all the stars are fixed stars, fixed in position relative to each other. So it makes no sense to talk about a new star, a new fixed star, stopping in the sky. What about a fourth possibility, a supernova? Well, that's almost the same argument as a nova, in the sense that it could appear in the east, it could be significant, especially if it was not that far away. If Betelgeuse went supernova, we would really know about it. It would be a very bright object in the night sky. It might even be a bright object in the day sky. But if it was that significant, why wasn't Herod aware of it? And generally speaking, if a star goes supernova and blows itself to pieces, it doesn't normally do it twice. Having died, it normally is dead. You don't get zombie stars which come back to life and then go bang a second time. So a star reappearing in the sky doesn't seem to be sensible for a supernova. And again, if it's a supernova, it's in a fixed position in the sky relative to the other stars. So why would you say the star stopped in the sky? That doesn't seem to work. So those first four candidates all seem to have some problems. There are some features which definitely fit the account, and it appears that some features don't. Not surprisingly, I've left the fifth one, which I think is a very interesting one. Could it have been the conjunction of planets? Could a conjunction of planets happen in the east? Yes. The planets go around the sun at different speeds, and they will occasionally line up in the sky, and that can happen pretty much anywhere in the zodiac, so yes, it could happen in the east. Would it have been significant? It depends on which two planets have aligned in which constellation. That's how you determine the significance of an astrological event. So yes, it could have been significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of what the Magi was talking about? It depends if you come to the same conclusions about the significance. Maybe different astrologers attach different significance to different events in the sky, in which case Herod might have been aware of the fact that two planets appeared in the same patch of sky, but didn't necessarily attach the meaning. That means there's going to be a birth of a new king of the Jews. So that is plausible. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, as we will see, planets go around the sun, and any two planets might be in conjunction at a particular time, and then later they might come into conjunction again. So yes, the star could reappear in the sky. And is it possible for planets to stop in the sky? Again, we're going to see in just a second that yes, that is possible. So it looks like conjunctions are feasible as a Star of Bethlehem. Let's just remind ourselves of the basics. Two hypothetical planets going around the sun. The most important takeaway message for planets orbiting the sun is that the closer they are to the sun, the faster they go around. It's not just because the racetrack is shorter, they are physically moving faster through space. And therefore, the different planets will be in different parts of the sky for some part of the year, and every once in a while they'll come and they appear to be in the same part of the sky as viewed from Earth. Generally speaking, they don't pass in front of each other because every planet is in an orbit which is slightly tilted relative to the Earth's orbit around the sun. So what usually happens when planets get close in the sky is just they miss each other slightly. Just like the moon generally misses the sun, we don't get a total eclipse of the sun every month. We don't get an eclipse of the moon every month. Generally speaking, as the moon orbits the Earth, it usually misses the sun by going slightly north or slightly south because of tilts. Same with planets. They might get close in the sky, but they generally don't line up exactly. And if we think of the inner planet, the green planet, as being Earth, and the outer planet, which could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, any of the planets with orbits outside that of the Earth, because the inner planets are moving faster, as we watch the planets orbit, let's assume they're going anti-clockwise, so we're looking from above the North Pole of the Earth. The planets are moving anti-clockwise around this diagram, so the planet is going from west to east as seen by the Earth. But when the Earth overtakes the planet on the inside lane, remember the inner planets are going faster, so the Earth will overtake on the inside lane, undertake if you like, and so as the Earth is going quite fast at this point, when we look at the more distant planet, although the planet is moving from west to east, it might appear to be going backwards, simply because the Earth is going faster. Pretty much the same as overtaking a car on the motorway. If you're in the outside lane going faster, then temporarily the car on your left in the slower lane might appear to be going backwards. So a distant planet might appear to be going from west to east most of the time, but then it stops in the sky, starts to move backwards, stops in the sky, and then starts to move forward again. And that will occur whenever you get this alignment of the sun, the Earth, and the planet. Whenever the Earth is effectively in between the planet and the sun. The Earth is going faster, and so for that short length of time, the planet will move backwards, normally west to east. Then it will stop, move in a so-called retrograde pattern, stop again, and then continue moving west to east in the sky across the zodiac. So-called retrograde planetary motion. So now we've got a better understanding of how planets move, we can start to think about how this conjunction might work. But let's just think about the timeline before we think about the details of that particular conjunction I have in mind. Here's a timeline around about the birth of Christ. Remember, there's no year zero. This is particularly important if you happen to have an app on your phone and you want to check what did it actually look like a few years BC. Bear in mind that when you go backwards through time, there are some apps, I'm not sure how many, there are some apps which actually go from 2 AD to 1 AD to 0 to 1 BC to 2 BC, etc. In other words, they insert a year that doesn't actually exist. And so if you ask some planetarium type software, what did the sky look like in a particular year BC, it gets it wrong by 1 year. I'm not going to name names as to which, because I'm not sure how many of them do that, but just bear that in mind. The simplest thing is just to go to a particular point, 1 AD, and then just go backwards 1 year at a time and see if it comes up with 0 AD as a year. So there was no year zero. When was Christ born? Well, because of lots of jiggery-pokery with the calendar. Of course, we're not using the same calendar that we did 2,000 years ago, so you have to do a little bit of calculation. We think Christ was born perhaps between 8 and 4 BC. That's based mainly on when did King Herod die. There's no easy way of dating the birth of Christ other than to say the birth of Christ must have preceded the death of Herod because of the story in the Bible. But there are some scholars, I don't claim to be a biblical scholar, but there are some scholars who say that King Herod died in 4 BC, but some scholars, perhaps the minority, say, no, you've got the date wrong, because King Herod's death was not dated as it's not written down anywhere. King Herod died in 4 BC. Surprisingly enough, that's not written down anywhere. So what's stated is King Herod died in the same year as we had the eclipse that followed the flood, that followed the famine. You know, it's a whole set of events that then gives you that particular date. When calculating Herod's death, some people say you got the wrong eclipse. It wasn't that eclipse, it was that eclipse that you should have been dating. And actually, King Herod died a little later, in 1 BC, not in 4 BC. Different people agree or disagree as to the arguments there. But the point is, that means that we are even less certain about when Christ was born. It's either a few years either side of 6 BC or possibly around 2 or 3 BC. So in terms of what happened when, were there any particular portents around that time that could have been interpreted as the Star of Bethlehem? Well, there certainly were comets around at the time. There was one particular comet around in 12 BC, which we know was quite bright, or at least we are fairly sure was quite bright. It had a big tail and was quite bright. We know that because it was Halley's comet, and Halley is always bright every time it comes around, and we can calculate that it was possibly even brighter at this particular apparition. So, a nice bright comet in the sky, great, but 12 BC? Isn't that a bit early for God to be posting on his Facebook page that something interesting is about to happen? It's at least sort of 6 years early and possibly even a decade earlier than the actual event itself. So that seems to be the wrong timing. There were other comets around in sort of 4-ish or 5-ish BC. One of them was Comet Holmes. I'm not sure you remember Holmes from nearly 20 years ago now, 2005 I think it was, that Comet Holmes came round and its coma expanded enormously as it came not so far away from the Earth. But it's not likely that it would have been a very bright spectacle when it passed in 5 or 6 BC. The other comet that was around in 4 BC, that is, what is that? Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Remember 67P Rosetta comet, the comet that Rosetta visited and put the little Philae lander down on? So that was around in about 4 BC. But it would not have been bright, it would not have had a spectacular tail because we know roughly what the composition of the comet is now that we've landed on it, and we can work out that there's pretty much no way that it would have been evaporating enough ice to produce a spectacular tail back then. So they were around at the time, but they would not have been spectacular objects, those two Halley, yes, but a bit early. The other two wouldn't have been bright enough. What about novae? Well, yes, there were novae around. The Chinese saw a nova in 5 BC, and the Koreans saw a nova in 4 BC. Now, nova that are particularly bright, clearly bright enough to be seen with the naked eye, we're not talking about telescopic novae here. Novae that are bright enough to be seen with the naked eye don't come around that often, once every few decades or few hundred years. Does that mean, like buses, 2 came along at once within a few months of each other? No, it's much more likely that because of the difficulty in translating one calendar into another calendar, it's much more likely that they were actually the same nova seen in late 5 BC, early 4 BC, or whatever, that the dates are just simply a few months off. So there was a nova visible in the sky at about the right time. But again, remember the arguments from earlier. Why would you talk about this star stopping in the sky when it's a fixed star? And is it very likely that this star would have appeared and then reappeared sometime later? It doesn't seem to fit the bill. But conjunctions, well, we have 2 very interesting conjunctions that are worth thinking about. There's a conjunction, I'm using the astrological symbols here, so the curly 4 means Jupiter, the curly H means Saturn, and this symbol on the far right is the symbol for Venus. And the little dumbbell on the left is just the standard symbol for conjunction. So there was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn around 6 BC, and some people believe that is the most likely explanation for the Star of Bethlehem, a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, just like the one we saw a few years back, where again Jupiter and Saturn got close in the sky. Remember, Jupiter can be quite bright, Saturn generally less so. For most people, Saturn is disappointing as a bright object because it's quite a few magnitudes fainter than Jupiter. So that is a possibility, but I think that one is much more interesting. There's a conjunction between Jupiter and Venus, and that's interesting for a number of reasons, not least because Venus is so much brighter than Saturn. Remember, Venus can get to about -4, -4.5 perhaps. Jupiter can get almost as bright. So these are the 2 brightest things in the night sky, other than the moon. And a conjunction of those 2 planets occurred around 2 BC or something. So you can see that the weakness of the argument is, well, it relies on the fact that if that was the Star of Bethlehem, then King Herod must have died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. But that is a biblical scholar's argument rather than an astronomical argument. Let's have a look at this particular set of conjunctions because it's rather interesting. I appreciate you can't read all the writing at the top here. What I've done is set up Starry Night so that we're looking in the direction of Leo, which I'm sure you all recognize. So we've got Cancer and Gemini off to the right, Libra over to the other side. We've got Regulus, the brightest star in Leo. And we've got Jupiter, which is marked as Jupiter, and the other planets I have not labeled, otherwise the screen gets full of labels as the planets move around the sun. I'm leaving the view fixed towards Leo. I'm not showing you where the horizon is because, again, if we move forward days and weeks and months, the horizon would be flipping around all over the place, and so I'm not showing the horizon because it just, basically you'll get motion sickness. I've got it set at the moment to 1st of August, 3 BC. Where should we be setting our viewpoint in terms of looking at the sky? Well, it doesn't make that much difference. If we're looking at where Jupiter is, it doesn't really matter whether we have the viewpoint in Jerusalem or in Persia or in India or in Outer Mongolia. We don't know the viewpoint of the Magi, and so given that it doesn't really matter, I've set the direction here, if the observation point, as the center of the Earth, because I don't know geographically where on the Earth I should be setting the Magi's viewpoint. So it'll be ever so slightly wrong by a few thousand kilometers, but remember the distance to Jupiter, etc., is so vast that a few thousand kilometers really makes no difference. So let's run the clock forward from August the 1st, 3 BC, and see what happens to Jupiter. There's Leo, and coming up behind it is the planet Venus. Remember, Venus is closer to the sun, so Venus is moving faster. So as things move from west to east, i.e. right to left in this particular picture, Jupiter is going to be moving right to left, but Venus is going to be moving faster. So if I run the clock forward, we see that Venus gets very close to Jupiter. So we have a conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. And this occurs at a time which would make it visible in the early morning before sunrise. So we have a star in the east. What's the significance of Venus being in conjunction with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo? Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea, or the people of Judea. So Venus and Jupiter in Leo means, to some astrologers, birth of the king of the Jews. So that's how they might interpret that particular conjunction. Venus and Jupiter aren't particularly close in the sky. They're a bit like Jupiter and Saturn that we saw a few years back. In other words, they would be closer than the diameter of the full moon, but they would still be very distinctly 2 points of light. They would just be 2 points of light which got closer and closer night after night or morning after morning. They would get closer in the sky and they would pass within half a degree of each other. I can't remember the actual distance here. So it would be significant to an astrologer because of Venus, Jupiter, Leo. And they might think, okay, something interesting is happening, and it's something to do with the birth of the King of the Jews. Let's keep watching the sky and see what God has to tell us. They watch further. Venus continues to move away. Jupiter is now moving towards Regulus. So the king of planets has just been in conjunction with the king of stars. Jupiter has just passed very close to Regulus. And because the Earth is overtaking or undertaking on the inside lane, Jupiter stops in the sky. It's no longer going from west to east. It stopped in the sky, and now it's moving backwards for a while the Earth overtakes it. So what's Jupiter now doing? Jupiter is now moving backwards and goes past Regulus again. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. And now the Earth has finished overtaking Jupiter. Jupiter will stop in the sky and then continue its prograde, its normal motion from west to east. And Jupiter, the king of planets, will pass Regulus, the king of stars, a third time over a period of a few months. So the astrologers were originally watching the sky and they got this indication that birth of the king of the Jews, of something is happening. They've then watched Jupiter and they've seen the king planet pass the king star, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Something is going on with kings. One king is somehow passing things on to another king. Maybe one king is coming to the end and a new king is coming online, as it were. This is interesting, they say. I wonder when we should go and talk to the people in the land of Judea and ask them about the birth of the king of the Jews. What's the starting pistol? Well, they keep watching the sky. And here's Venus that's back again because it's going around the sun so quickly. Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter a second time. So the birth of the king of the Jews, it's still in the constellation of Leo. Birth of the king of the Jews is reinforced a second time. And this is a really, really close conjunction compared to what we saw before. Let's just center up Jupiter. Remember, no telescopes 2,000 years ago. So what would they have seen? Well, if you imagine what we would see if we could look at it through a telescope, let's zoom in to see just how close that conjunction is. How close do you want it? From certain points of the Earth, the disk of one planet will appear to touch another. Okay, the distances, of course, are very different, but from certain perspectives on the Earth, they would appear to touch. We're looking at a field of view of arc minutes. We're dealing a fraction of an arc minute here. We are talking about a field of view such that I don't think any human could resolve these as 2 points of light. At this particular point, Venus will be a magnitude of about -4 and Jupiter -3.5, so almost as bright as Venus. So these 2 bright points of light have come together night after night, and at one point they are so close together that they could not be resolved by a human eye as 2 separate points of light. This doesn't happen very often. A conjunction this close is quite rare. I'm not sure exactly how many times you can expect it to happen. I'd be surprised if it happens more often than a few times every millennium. So it's virtually a given that the Magi and every other astrologer would never have seen anything like this before. The points of light, the wandering stars in the sky, generally speaking, would always be separate, but on this particular occasion, they would have merged together into one very bright object. So, to summarize what might have been seen in the sky, in late 3 BC, there was a reasonable but not particularly spectacular conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, which could be interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews because of Venus, Jupiter, and the land of Judea. If you keep watching the sky, you then see Jupiter pass Regulus, not once, not twice, but 3 times, a triple conjunction of the King of Planets with the King of Stars. That might have been seen as somehow one king handing over to another king. If you keep watching the sky, then Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction a second time, but now they are so close, they merge together as one object in the sky. Not a close conjunction, but a conjunction that cannot be resolved as 2 separate points. So that might have been the starting gun. If they then decided to go to Jerusalem and ask Herod what's going on, how long would it have taken them to get to Jerusalem? No idea at all, because we don't know where they came from. We don't know whether it was Persia or India or Mongolia, and we don't know whether or not they were walking or whether they had camels. Now, if you believe the Christmas cards, they were always on camels, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were on camels. So it could have taken them a few months, it could have taken them many, many months to get from wherever they were to Jerusalem and ultimately Bethlehem. It's interesting to note that if you think that it took them quite a few months to get there and say, well, what if they arrived in sort of later on that year? Later that year, Jupiter does stop in the sky. On which date does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? It stops in the sky on the 25th of December. Yes. Yes, that is just pure coincidence, because we know that the 25th of December is just the Christians taking over a pagan Saturnalia, basically celebrating the passing of the longest night. But it's interesting that it just happens to work out that way. So yes, Jupiter does stop in the sky later that same year. So there's a sequence of events that definitely occurred. The question is, would they have been interpreted the way I've indicated? So it's possible that there was such a conjunction. It's possible that this was viewed and seen by people and then passed down from one generation to another for quite a few decades and eventually got woven into the fabric of the Gospel of St. Matthew, which was written a century and plus later. Maybe it was a different astronomical event. Maybe it was a combination of astronomical events. Maybe it wasn't one thing. Maybe it was a conjunction and a comet, or various other things happening in tandem, as it were. Working out the facts, i.e. dialing the clock back 2,000 years, is easy. If we know exactly where the planets are now, it is very easy to work out where the planets were 2,000 years ago. We can do that with phenomenal accuracy. Even on your phone, you can do it with phenomenal accuracy. What's tricky is second-guessing what the significance would be applied to that particular observation in the sky. We are, of course, just speculating. We know that event happened. It might have been that the astrologers interpreted that event in the following way. Pure speculation, but interesting nonetheless. But of course, regardless of how you interpret what happened 2,000 years ago, the message is pretty much still the same. I hope everybody has a very peaceful New Year and a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you all.